This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 59 of Here's How. It's more than 3 years since we had and rejected the referendum to abolish Seanad. How has it been doing ever since? And what about all those promises of reform? In this episode, I'm talking to one of the people who campaigned to keep the Seanad.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
The Disclosures Tribunal is the tribunal into the treatment of Garda whistleblowers, chaired by Judge Peter Charlton. Opposition parties have called for it to be expanded. They're wrong. They were wrong to get it established, and they were wrong to see a widening of its remit. In recent years, we've had the MacLochlainn Tribunal, the Morris Tribunal, the Mahon Tribunal, the Lindsay Tribunal, the Barr Tribunal, the Boyle Tribunal, the Morris Tribunal, and the Smithick Tribunal, and that's just the tribunals. There was also the Farrelly Commission, the Fennelly Commission, the Banking Sector Commission, the MacLochlainn Commission, the Ballyborough Garda District Investigation, the Mother and Baby Homes Commission, the IRBC Commission, and others. And just to show you how much the currency of these investigations have been devalued, you didn't even notice that I put in a fake one there, the MacLochlainn Commission. And actually that's a lie. The MacLochlainn Commission does exist. It's investigating the shooting of a bank robbery suspect by the gardaí. The fake one was the Boyle Tribunal, and you didn't notice that either. And before I get too John Oliver on this, the point is that we have so many of them, we know that if inquiries solved anything, we'd be well sorted. Consider this. The gardaí are in a state of disarray, with low morale, poor discipline, lack of oversight, and a culture of silence. It could have been written last week, but that was how Village magazine summarised the report of the Morris Tribunal in 2005. A dozen years later, the Charlton Tribunal could save a lot of time and effort by just doing Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V with the findings of the Morris Tribunal. The state already has a body to investigate crime. It's called An Garda Síochána. One of the excuses they give for not doing their job is that they don't want to interfere with the work of the tribunal, as though the judge was that mummified Buddhist monk whose followers insist that he's just deep in meditation. The Morris Tribunal found as fact in 2011, more than 6 years ago, that MacLochlainn had an insidious and pervasive influence over the awarding of the 086 licence to Denis O'Brien's company Digiphone. Ever since, Justice Ministers Shatter and Fitzgerald have been parroting the same line again and again that the gardaí are waiting for the advice of the Director of Public Prosecutions with a view to determining whether or not a full Garda investigation should be commenced. And when I say parroting it, I don't mean that they've been giving roughly the same message. They've actually said exactly the same text, word for word, at least 5 times in the Dáil. I'll give links to those speeches. But the real point is that they have spent 6 years, the gardaí has spent 6 years waiting for advice on whether or not to begin a criminal investigation. The bones of the story were known since 1997 when the Morris Tribunal was established. That's why it was established 20 years ago, so they're 20 years late on starting a criminal investigation. In 1975, Cardinal Sean Brady, then a 36-year-old priest, took statements from 2 young victims of the notorious rapist Brendan Smith. He swore the boys to secrecy, telling them that it would be a grave sin for them to tell anyone what they suffered, such as, for example, reporting it to gardaí. When this came to light following the 2010 Murphy report, Brady claimed that he understood that some other priest would report it to gardaí. but he never got curious about why weeks, months and years later there was no report of Smith being arrested. For 18 more years, Brendan Smith raped and abused children who might have escaped had Brady not browbeaten the earlier victims into silence. Compare that to the case of the UK Cabinet Minister Chris Huhne. He dodged penalty points when his wife agreed to report that she, and not he, was driving their car when it was clocked speeding. When uncovered, Huhne and his wife were convicted of perverting the course of justice, forcing his resignation from Parliament and from Cabinet. He served 2 months of an 8-month jail sentence, and he was subjected to curfew enforced by electronic tagging for the rest of his sentence. He went from the Cabinet table to HMP Wandsworth for fiddling penalty points. In Ireland, Section 41 of the Criminal Justice Act is the equivalent law. It says, "A person who harms or threatens, menaces or in any way intimidates or puts fear in another person who is a witness or potential witness for an offence, with the intention thereby of causing the investigation or the course of justice to be obstructed, perverted or interfered with, shall be guilty of an offence." Listeners, you can decide whether you think that Cardinal Brady should be charged under that law, but the Garda Síochána have not seen fit even to open an investigation, much less take him in for questioning, in the 7 years since his role in the Brendan Smith cover-up has become public. The Flood Tribunal found as fact 15 years ago that Oliver Barry of Century Radio paid Ray Burke an enormous bribe for favouring his station. Burke was briefly sent to jail for filing false tax returns. In other words, he didn't declare the bribe for tax purposes. But neither Burke nor Barry were ever the subject of a criminal investigation for bribery. Tribunals and commissions are not insidious just because they achieve nothing. They actively shield the guilty from prosecution. For the years that they continue, they mustn't be disturbed by such frivolities as bringing criminals to justice. And when they report, they give fodder to otherwise unheard of backbenchers and senators who are wheeled out to focus on lawyers' fees and distract from the findings until public anger dissipates. In Ireland, any objective observer can see that just like that mummified monk, justice is dead.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
In October 2013, there was a referendum to decide whether or not to abolish the Seanad. It was narrowly defeated, and one of the people who was in part of the successful campaign to defeat it was the former Green Party TD and Senator Dan Boyle. He's on Skype with me now. Dan, during that campaign, there was an awful lot of talk about saying the Seanad should be not abolished, it should be reformed. How's the reform going?
Very slowly indeed. I think we have an interesting Seanad that's been selected subsequently, and I think the Doyle arithmetic should be helpful to the situation, but the Taoiseach and the Kenny has been particularly unhelpful in trying to progress any movement towards Seanad reform whatsoever. There are templates there. We have an agreed report from a number of years ago that Mary O'Rourke and Michael McDowell would have been involved with. Mm-hmm. And it seems the easiest path forward in the sense that it doesn't require any constitutional changes. But for the most part, the issue has just been messed around with the various constitutional conventions that have been put in place since that referendum. And there's no real sincerity on the half of the political establishment to have actual Seanad reform.
Was there ever?
I think there is amongst some, and people can see the value of it if looked at in the terms of having better quality legislation, which is the whole point of having a second house, a revising chamber. But it easily gets caught up in a populist view that there are too many people involved in politics. It's not a good use of public money, that the country would be better run by Michael O'Leary, all these narratives
hold on a second. That's a bit... there's an awful lot of shades of difference between we should have the gravy train that is the Seanad and the country should be run by Michael O'Leary. Wasn't the campaign, particularly the Democracy Matters campaign that was this coalition of people for retaining the Seanad, wasn't that fundamentally dishonest?
No, I don't think so, because I suppose the comparison could be a contrast with the Brexit campaign in Britain, where people were trying to stop something happening coming out of the EU, and they actively lied to change what an actual situation was.
Yeah, but hang on a second. The people who were campaigning to retain the Seanad, and I'm looking, and I'll put in the notes for this podcast, I'll put images of some of the leaflets, but I have one here there was one group called Future Matters. And they have two sides, and they say, vote no to abolition, vote for reform. And they presented it as being alternatives, either reform or abolition. There was never any reform on the agenda. That's true, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. There have been 13 reports on how the Seanad should be reformed from the 1930s.
And not a one of them implemented.
Well, not really seriously. I think there have been cosmetic changes along the way, but nothing that has changed the fundamental political or constitutional position of the Seanad. I think it's slightly unfair to say that those who are promoting a no vote against abolition in that referendum have failed to deliver. They haven't been in a position to achieve. They have not been in government. They haven't even.
Well, that's not true, because Fianna Fáil have been in government, and they were leading the campaign to retain the Seanad.
Well, actually, not since the referendum. But you might say they're in and out of government at the moment, but they haven't formally been in government since.
Sorry, that's true. I didn't manage to tell the difference. Sometimes you forget. But, for example, and I'm looking specifically at one of the Democracy Matters leaflets here, and these are 3 bullet points. I'm not taking them from different places. They're straight in a row, and I'll read it out verbatim. It says, more democracy, gender equality, experts in the Oireachtas. Wasn't there a fundamental contradiction between the people who are saying we will reform the Seanad and make it more democratic, make it more democratically elected, and we will reform the Seanad and have it bring in experts in particular areas?
No, I don't think so, because the people who made those arguments still believe in those arguments, still want to see those things happening.
No, but either the Seanad represents special interests or it is democratically elected. It can't be both.
I think the formula that came up in that MacDonald-Rourke report is something that's eminently feasible. It does talk about representation.
Okay, so you have something that you think you have something that is possible and desirable. Give us a picture of what that is.
Well, that report, for instance, 43 of the 60 seats in the Seanad at the moment are elected by an electorate that's about 1,000 people, members of the Oireachtas and county councillors, city and county councillors.
Yeah.
There's nothing to stop that electorate being every single person in the country. There's nothing in the Constitution that stops that from happening.
And what would its point be?
Its point would be that you could opt in and out of the various vocational panels. The people could decide whether they're an elector or a candidate for cultural education or industrial and commercial.
What on earth is the benefit of that? Other than manage, I mean, I can see how, okay, you can crowbar that into the current constitutional requirements, but what's the actual point of it?
Well, what it does is it helps refine and define politics in the sense that you have specialised electorates, specialised candidates who will be addressing particular issues in a newly defined context. And it's utterly democratic.
To what end?
in the end that you get a better quality of public representative.
Okay, hold on. Let's go back and look at where the Seanad came from. In 1931, there was an encyclical from Pope, I think, Pius XI. It was called Quadragesimo Anno, and it essentially was a response to the growing amount of demand for the end of empires and the demand for democracy in Europe. The papacy and the Catholic Church at the time was fairly solidly against democracy, and they could see that the empires had collapsed after World War I, and their response was this encyclical, which suggested panels of vested interests of various different supposed experts or leaders of industry. And this was the basis of Italian fascism, whereby they were opposed to democracy, but they realized that they needed some sort of decision-making body. And this is what influenced the 1937 Constitution, and you get these panels. How many people are on the agricultural panel?
It's either 11 or 13. It's probably 11, I think.
Yeah. How many people are on the software panel?
I think that's an excellent argument for looking at and reviewing the panel system.
Yeah, but that's not possible without removing
that requires constitutional change.
Yeah. My point is, there's no way within the current constitutional arrangement to make the Seanad in any way rational.
Well, no. You still have Taoiseach's nominees, which is the committee we're saying should be allocated on a specified basis. And that could bring in defined people that would take into account changed society, changed technology, the changed nature of the world we're living in. I'm not a great fan of corporate structures, but if we're going to achieve Seanad reform, we have two routes. Mm-hmm. One is to use the existing structures and to try to change it legislatively to make it more democratic, or two is to try to change it constitutionally, which is a lot more messy. And I think there's a lot of value in the McDowell-O'Rourke report that helps us go down the first road a great distance.
It does seem, though, that between yourself, Michael McDowell, and Mary O'Rourke, the three things, very, very different politically people, the one thing that you have in common is that you've benefited from the gravy train.
Oh, gosh, I wish I had. I certainly isn't showing in my bank account in the moment anyway. I can tell you that.
Dan, I think that's very tone deaf to an awful lot of people. You were deputy leader of the Seanad
yes.
for 4 years. That is a position that came with a salary far more than an awful lot of Irish people will ever see.
And I'm aware of that. I'm also aware that I just paid off a £30,000 debt after 20 years of electioneering. So it's my contribution to public life is nothing I'm going to apologise for, and I'm proud to have served, and I'm proud to.
Sure, but what does the Seanad? Okay, even at its high watermark, after 70 or whatever years of existence, nobody has found why it should exist.
Well, I can tell you something. My proudest political achievement was done through the Seanad, not the Dáil.
Tell me.
I introduced a private member's bill. It passed all stages in the Seanad. Mm-hmm. I received a commitment then from the Minister for State and the Department of Health, who subsequently saw that bill through the following Dáil. And it was an amendment of the Mental Health Act that allowed that finished the principle of coercion in relation to applying electroconvulsive therapy treatment.
That I'm sure that's valuable. It's not an area that I'm expert on, but I don't think
it wouldn't have happened in a Dáil setting. It wouldn't have happened in a Dáil setting, I would argue, because the Seanad it debates differently, it examines differently, and it brings about a long-term approach to the legislation.
Dan, are you seriously following the argument that the Seanad, the failed county councillors and the chums of the current Taoiseach, for some reason have a better debating style? I mean, I'm just looking at a couple of things. First of all, if you look at Google Trends, you can see that the Seanad shows up in Google searches roughly zero, other than when there's an election, and the only real big spike was actually around the time of the election.
Look, but for example, Well, look, I'll give you examples because Google Trends is a modern invention. The first debates on social policy in this issue, on the issues of divorce, on civil partnership and same-sex marriages, on issues like contraception, all happened in the Senate.
No, they didn't. They happened in the pubs and clubs around Ireland.
Well, politically, they happened in the Senate. They were
what do those debates have over and above sitting on a bar stool on a Friday night?
Well, first of all, they introduce the issue. Secondly, they tease out the issue. Thirdly, they put
still not getting the difference.
A legal background on it. Look, you don't pass any laws on a bar stool.
And to be fair, you don't pass any laws in the Seanad either. But for example, since you've quoted those, we've had, for example, Ned O'Sullivan, who introduces the, pressing topic of seagulls getting above and beyond themselves, to put it in his words. We have Joe O'Reilly just recently telling us that the ban on pubs opening on Good Friday is a part of our national identity. Do really people have nothing better to be saying than this sort of nonsense?
Well, I think for every Ned O'Sullivan and Joe O'Reilly, you have a Healy Ray, you have a Matty McGrath.
But the point is, and much as I dislike them, they're democratically elected, and in the Seanad, nobody is.
But that isn't, well, actually, everyone is. People are either elected by people who themselves are elected, or they're appointed by someone who has been elected.
But the Dáil is democratically
they have
elected.
A different form of elected. Everyone in the Seanad is elected. They have a different form of election. That's true of other second chambers. The German second chamber is also elected by people who are elected and not by popular vote. The French second chamber is also elected by people who are elected and not by popular vote.
None of this is an excuse for the type of nonsense we hear out of the Fidelma Healy Rays and the Ned O'Sullivans and the Paul Coughlan's and a whole horde of other people that we've never heard of.
Your problem is not with the institution; it's with political culture.
No. My problem is with the institution and those people, because of the almost zero attention that is given by the media to the Seanad, because that's what it deserves. Those people get in and get fat salaries in order to aggrandise themselves and keep a seat warm that they hope to win in the next Dáil.
Well, that's motivation for some people. It isn't a motivation for every person. There are people who seek election to the Seanad and want to retain a membership of the Seanad because they believe it's a valuable institution.
Okay, let's put it ideally in as you would see it.
Yeah.
Should the Dáil be democratically elected? And by democratically elected, I mean that each person can cast a vote that has a real contribution to electing the people there.
You mean the Seanad? Yes.
The Seanad, yes.
I do believe that. I've always believed that. Yes.
Okay, so if you do that, that means that it will be run by political parties, because it's plainly obvious that when people vote for good or ill, they vote overwhelmingly for political parties or independent politicians. They don't vote for so-called experts or academics.
Well, that's not necessarily true, because we actually have had one public Seanad election in this country in 1925.
Oh, okay. What happened a century ago isn't that relevant. Look, Dan, let's be reasonable on this. When you look at presidential elections, European elections, local elections and Dáil elections, they all go along more or less the same party lines. There's no distinct pattern where you can see that people vote dramatically differently in, for example, local elections than they do in Dáil elections.
Well, actually, that is not true. I mean, the independents and smaller parties are more likely to get higher votes in second-level elections. That is a trend.
Yes, but there is no trend that people claim that the Seanad should be the place for experts and academic debate. There's no trend that voters assess people on that basis.
Well, you could make the case that it was put to the people and the people decided otherwise, So, I mean, if you want to make the case that the people were lied to, I think that's an unfair argument, because the potential of change still exists, and the people who should be introducing the change are refusing to do so.
But people, in hindsight, the people who said, if you miss this opportunity to abolish the Seanad, there will be no reform and it will be very unlikely you'll get another opportunity. That was entirely correct, wasn't it?
No, not necessarily. I think, as with divorce, as with the Lisbon and Nice treaties, there are questions that can be put again and again. As a Democrat, I have no difficulty with that. None at all. I mean, I would favour mechanisms that existed in our first constitution. The first Seanad had the opportunity of having public plebiscites brought about by petition.
But these are basically, and it got abolished, and with good reason. These are toys of political theorists. In reality, voters pay relatively little attention. They know the party they like, and they know when they get to dislike them, and they vote on that basis. And the level of detail in voting decisions needed for that type of arrangement to work just doesn't exist.
Well, I think there's a lot of presumptions you're making there. I think public engagement and interest in the Dáil is quite low. I think the ability of people on the street,
yeah, but it's way higher.
Their elected it may be higher, but it's still low. And the ability to even know who their elected representatives are is quite low. So you're presuming there's a level of public engagement that exists with the general political system, which doesn't exist at all. And again,
I'm 100% certain. However low that engagement is with the Dáil, it is vastly higher than it is with the Seanad.
Yeah, probably. But the problem is not institutional; it's cultural. We claim to be a sophisticated electorate. We claim to be a widely consulted.
Nobody, but a politician says that.
Well, I'm not too sure about that. I mean, I've heard a lot of people who are in diplomacy and civil service mention that it's a constant myth that we invent about ourselves.
The political elite may say that, yes, but nobody says that on a bar stool anywhere outside Dublin 4. But just to go to the core point of it, and looking again, and I'm going to post some of these leaflets, and it just shows how dishonest that Democracy Matters campaign was. At the same time, and often in the same breath, people were saying that the Seanad should be more democratically elected, and that it should have places reserved for minorities. Those two are just fundamentally impossible. That's true, isn't it?
I don't accept that. No, I think it is possible to square that particular circle. What you have is that you have the overwhelming number of places that are voted for, and you have a recognition of minorities in a set number of spaces. That exists.
So you have reserved seats that don't get democratically elected?
No, they are elected by a specified electorate, which is democratic in itself.
Such as?
Well, the original Seanad operated on that basis. The original Seanad was appointed to protect minorities and had a large representation of minority members as a result of that. In fact, it was kind of historically it played an extremely important role to help blend people who would have been part of the British establishment into the new Irish
I think the word you're
state.
searching for is Protestants.
Well, that would have been the significant minority.
Okay. Listeners can decide for themselves whether they think it is possible to both be more democratic and more representative of minorities and vested interests. I don't want to go around in circles. Another claim that was made was that the Seanad would not be just a talking shop, but it wouldn't have the power to overrule the Dáil. Those two are fundamentally incompatible, and people got up on platforms and almost within the same breath said that those two reforms would be made. Those are totally incompatible with each other.
Again, that's a question of emphasis. The second chamber of any functioning democracy is not there to overrule its lower house.
But to the extent that it isn't, it is a talking shop.
It is a revising chamber.
Okay, it couldn't both be more and less powerful simultaneously, and people who were promising that it could were dishonest.
No, if you're talking about effectiveness, of course it can. Of course it can. No one is saying that Seanad is perfect. Seanad has to improve its game, has to up its game, and that was a feature of the campaign itself.
What's your evidence for that?
The fact is that
you said it has to improve its game. Obviously, it doesn't. It's as much of a joke as it ever was, and it's as much of a gravy train as it ever was.
Look, there are two value judgments on your part, and
do you disagree with them?
Agree. I partially agree with you. Because I think when you make those type of arguments, it's broad brushstrokes, and it implies that anyone who's involved has the same motivation.
I think there's about maybe half a dozen people in the Seanad who are worthwhile, and that might be a loss. Do you know the platform that half a dozen people who are worthwhile have?
I think it's far more than that. I think it's far more than that.
We can disagree on that, and we can see how much impact they make to judge that. But you are correct to say that this kind of broad brushstroke and taking ridiculous examples isn't a good argument in itself. But it speaks to how little respect the people in the institution have for it.
Well, not only people certain people in the institution.
Okay, so when people who are members of Seanad Éireann get up and make ludicrous speeches about seagulls as though they were something new, that is that particular senator having contempt for the Seanad.
Well, I don't think that's first of all, you'd have to have motivation to do that. I mean, people's ability to either articulate or to define a coherent argument is a different thing altogether. Whether someone has a contemptuousness for democratic procedures or institutions, I think you'd have to be quite willful to do that. I don't think so. I think it's just that that someone who says that, or someone who repeats ludicrous conspiracy theories that they half read and half misunderstood off conspiracy websites like Pascal Mooney or Fidelma Healy, whatever her name is. People who don't have the courtesy to check out what they're saying and get up and make a speech as though they were half caught on a bar stool on a Friday night, and have that level of quality of their debate, they are holding it in contempt, aren't they? William, you've just described the President of the United States. There are flaws in the individuals. There are flaws in the characters of the people involved. Yeah, it is not the institution that is bringing about that.
And if 90% of the presidents of the United States had that attitude, you would start saying that that's probably not a worthwhile institution.
To be replaced by what?
well, fortunately, the Seanad does sod all, so it doesn't need to be replaced with anything.
Well, the question, I think even since the referendum, there have been some significant votes where legislation have been changed in the Seanad that has proved its usefulness.
Sure, but that could have been done in the Dáil. It was just done for this is one of the myths.
That's the whole point. It couldn't have been done in the Dáil, and particularly in this particular Dáil, there is a need for a separate chamber to revise legislation to look at it properly. If you look at the issue of water, for instance, look at the mess that the Dáil is making out of water. There is no rational debate. There is no logical coherence or consistency in that debate. You need to have a political chamber with people who look at a long-term view. But what
motivates them to do that? Do you really think that people like Pascal Mooney or Fidelma Healy Ames, who parrot off stuff that they read from conspiracy theory websites, do you think that's a long-term view?
Well, both of those examples you just mentioned, like me, are no longer members of the Senate. So they have nothing to do with the current argument.
Yeah, but actually I can remember them. The current members of the Seanad are so forgettable that I can't actually remember hardly any of them off the top of my head. But we've had a good argument. Dan Boyle, former Green Party TD and Senator, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks, William.
If you liked the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
That's almost the end of episode 59 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 18th of March 2017. I have images of the Seanad abolition referendum literature that I was talking about, and references to most of the other things in the show notes for this episode on the website. And one new feature. I know there's a lot of people out there who don't necessarily have iPhones or don't use podcast software, and they just listen to the podcast on the website. So I have a new feature. You can submit your email and get an alert each time a new podcast comes out. I promise I won't use it for anything else. Just enter your email address and you get a simple email with a link to click and listen to each new podcast. If you can think of a topic that should be covered in a future show, or if you want to suggest someone to include, and that could be yourself, then let me know. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and give it a rating or even write a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook, follow the podcast on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, follow Dan Boyle at Send Boyle, and subscribe to the podcast so new shows automatically come into your podcast feed. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software, or, like I said, you can subscribe by email now as well. There is full information about all of that and contact details for the show all at www.here'show.ie. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.